Hello and welcome back. This is number 5, Secret Himalayas, and today we're going to talk about legends of the Immortals, widening the sphere once again to consider other places that believe in hidden repositories of wisdom. But we must start with a quote, and it's a Chinese one from Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu said, "Do you have the patience to wait till your mud settles and the water is clear? Can you remain unmoving till the right action arises by itself?" These old words of wisdom are the legends of the Immortals, people who inhabit the Silk Road, the Himalayas, and other mountain ranges. If Shambhala is a place where the enlightened reside, centered in Tibet as history suggests, its influence across a wider range of territory is larger still. Whilst Shambhala is sold as a resplendent, luxurious kingdom across the border in China, Taoists yearn for simplicity, which for them became the hallmark of genuine mysticism. It is therefore all the more unfortunate that the ignorant era of communism has attempted to eradicate all traces of homegrown wisdom in its midst. For the Taoists, they have signposted the influence of the masters more than most. In the idyllic retreats of Kunlun, Chinese Pinyin, the mountains contain mystical stories of immortals which abound. It is also of interest as legendary history is intertwined with real-life Chinese historical characters, which appear to foster many unanswered questions about what the ancients believed was inspiring to their civilization, which is always allied to the umbilical cords of mystical dimensions. The Kunlun mountain range is the longest chain of mountains in Asia. They reside in the southern part of Central Asia, but perhaps the northernmost parts of the roof of the world. The range extends east to west, some 1,250 miles across. They touch the Pamirs in Pakistan on the westerly side, and face up the Karakorums to the south, and on the southeasterly aspect, the plateau of Tibet, which is one of the two sources of China's major rivers, known as the Yellow River, by which ancient repute followed from heaven straight from the Milky Way. The Yellow River is considered the cradle of Chinese civilizations, with many expressions and myths attached to it. The Kunlun Mountains, according to myth, hold a jade palace frequented by a ruler called Guan Yin, a goddess of mercy. Like a lot of Central Asian gods and goddesses, names can be interchangeable, as are borderlines, and she can be equated with similar descriptions and alternative names according to the region or language, but her remit and location remains the same. Or her place and motives found in ancient scripture show Guan Yin in various guises, but the overall message is clear. She is a feminine aspect of mercy, as well as the oldest deity in Chinese culture. Many of the ancient Chinese tea rituals are based on the 8-segmented square. Guanyin tea, named after the goddess Guanyin, is an alternative form of Huanjing. She hides in her garden concealed by clouds, which is dominated by a massive peach tree dedicated to immortality, in which bears a fruit that matures every 6,000 years. Her association with the night skies is pinpointed on the Big Dipper. We call it the plough in the UK, and it can be seen in the skies. This goddess that decides how long any being shall live on this earth and presides over them in the afterlife also. Another name for the peach goddess is Wang Mu, goddess of the West. An approximate translation of Wang Mu from Chinese means sovereign mother, and she is featured in the I Ching as the 49th hexagram. If you look at the I Ching lower triagram being associated with both leopards and tigers, Wang Mu can be seen in some paintings as taking the form of a tiger. The upper part of this particular I Ching triagram is represented by a lake. One conclusion is to place the two triagrams together like a sum, equaling a single hexagram. One meaning therefore could be construed from this hexagram that the home of Wang Mu is at the foot of the Kunlungs near a lake. However, in the I Ching, hexagram 35, the word Wang Mu is mentioned and suddenly takes on the aspect of the grandmother, or in a slant of meaning, female ancestors. She is connected to weaving and therefore associated with silk, needlework, sewing and dressmaking. Wang in Chinese is also the word to denote the spirit world. One of the aspects of Wang Mu through various dynasties and their effects upon the populace was that Wang Mu allowed women to separate themselves from traditional role models imposed upon them: dutiful daughter, young mother, or older extended family member. Therefore, she became associated by researchers who suggested that she had an association with something called the Jade Maidens, and they are bawdy singers, musicians, brothel workers, and also to seducers of young boys, but this aspect was never discussed openly. As for Wang Mu herself, the mainstay of her worship was always in the northeast of China, but her veneration gained popularity and spread to parts of southeast China. Her crown is the loom, for she is the cosmic weaver. The most auspicious date connected with this deity was the 7th hour on the 7th day of the 7th month. This is mainly due to her connection with the 7 stars of the plough, or the Big Dipper as we call it, a constellation which we'll see has great import later in this story. During the Ming period in China, which is about the 1300s to the 1600s, when Taoism and Buddhism converged to give rise to Wang Mu proper, who advised that adherents who sought her wisdom should seek paradise upon their death in the West. The two paths of Taoism and Buddhism did not always agree, but in this goddess they were able to find common ground as the deity representative of both teachings. In one way it demonstrates the equality of the Chinese system, that female and male gods were considered on a par, echoing yin and yang aspects of the universe. Likewise, Wang Mu hosted from the grounds of her wonderful jade pagoda, sitting west of the Kunlun, the arrival of the first primordial beings, Nu and Ku. That's a sort of Chinese equivalent from the West of Adam and Eve in Christianity, living as they did in a paradise. Nu and Ku are, according to myth, the descendant of all Chinese people and culture. What is interesting here is the name of their host, Wang Mu, as her last name, Mu, M-U, appears in various forms worldwide and is always associated with the Great Flood, the survival or revival of the human race, and specific myths as a super race of gods who gave birth to mankind. The Mu legacy features prominently in the Roof of the World sagas. This is not lost on Chinese revolutionary called Si. He was born in about 1872, who was born in Sydney, Australia, before moving to Hong Kong. Si sought to exploit the legend of Mu to his own ends. He wrote a work entitled The Creation, the Garden of Eden, and the Origin of the Chinese. To truncate the rather complex theory, Si was convinced that the Garden of Eden had been located just north of the Kunlun range, boxed in by Khotan and the river Tarim. Si also tried to weave into this incredible notion the age-old myth of a sunken continent which he placed in the Pacific near Papua New Guinea, stretching to near South America, and his sketches were made in red ink to show a landmass to be identical in the shape of the mythical Mu of the Atlantis legends. Controversial it may have been, but see positive evidence quoted in the Bible that in Eden one river broke out into 4 separate rivers. His other maps in black and red ink show the river Tarim going westwards to become 4 distinct rivers Aksu, Kashgar, Yakhan and Khotan. He placed Indian itself in what is known as today as Chinese Turkestan, which is always in the news now, Xinjiang. The astonishing theory appeared in 1914, and the world had more pressing matters to attend to, so it kind of got lost. There was a big world war happening. But Xi went on to become a Christian social reformer, key in persuading some of his countrymen from the practice of foot binding, so that was a good thing, and later founded the newspaper, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, the South China Morning Post, which I used to read every morning. Other researchers, such as Andrew Thomas, may have not taken up the ideas of Xi literally, but are willing again to look at his Wang Mu, Queen of the West, and the freezing bleak peaks of the Kunlun. Echoing Shambhala myths, it was said that the only virtuous and wise people could reach Wang Mu and the Peach Garden. This is a common theme, of course, as we've known in the previous episodes. The actual tree there was the peach tree of immortality, and again it has parallels with biblical imagery. At a prearranged time, those select individuals of high virtue would be invited to eat a peach from the tree to become immortals themselves. Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, father of the Taoist way, is said to have made the perilous crossing of the Gobi Desert towards the end of his life to the peach garden of Wang Mu. Lao Tzu's legacy is perhaps the greatest of all Chinese mystical tracts, the I Ching. It is also closely associated with the principle of all imperial rulers, the Yellow Emperor Huang Di, patron of all esoteric arts, and the father of the Chinese civilization. Taoist philosopher Lao Tzu spoke of the ancient ones, and in his last sojourn to the west he headed off to the fabled garden of Wang Mu. Whether he made it there or not is not recorded, as he simply went off the pages of history. Later, other wise men, and even the odd emperor, set out on this same journey to seek an audience with the immortals. Could those same immortals, such as Wang Mu, be yet another expression of the inner circle of humanity, the hidden directorate? At this point, it might be a good idea to mention something about the country of satisfaction. The Chinese sages wrote about the country of satisfaction, which closely resembles Shambhala, and I would say in every respect. Here again, we've been here before, with the sacred peach tree blossoms, all desires are met, and peace and tranquility reign supreme inside the country of satisfaction. Such was the renown of Wang Mu that even the great Taoists like Lao Tzu, as we've mentioned, sought refuge, drawn as they were by the legends themselves. Neighbouring nations also harboured such tales of a fantastic realm but beyond normal life, which was the source of harmonious existence. The Kyrgyz nation talked of Mutska Ata, which followed the similar theme, the blissful sanctuary guarded by sacred truths, in which grew a sacred plum tree in this case, whose fruits dispensed longevity and even immortality. Where these ideas came from may, to our Western perceptions, be merely wishful thinking, like the Grail heritage in Britain, which must firmly remain within the confines of myth. Yet the Oriental mind does not accept this viewpoint. Unfortunately, much damage has been done to Chinese culture by successive communist incursions, but it is now hard to gauge the mindset of China as it was. But we must look to the remaining Lamists in Mongolia, Tibet, Nepal and Ladakh. We're faced with a dilemma in which we see these myths as factual elements, physical places that one can actually visit. And this may be a mistake. The views of the Masters of Wisdom, or Hidden Directorate, is that this is a palpable state. Many Freemasons may concur with this idea, as we've long seen that they believe in the existence of secret chiefs and unknown superiors who dictate the direction of their movement. In Asiatic circles, these places have become the thrones of gods from which beneficial cosmic energies flow outwards towards humanity. Such was the Chinese obsession with the affairs of the incarnate gods taking human form. They formed the official office of state called Li Fan Yuan, which oversaw matters of foreign policy, such as tulkus being born, as the Bogd Khan discussed in the previous episode. Even to this day, atheist communists in Beijing follow a long tradition and are nervous of Tulku lineages in neighboring states. In many ways, China is as Confucian as it has ever been. However, the spirit of the Tao still permeates Chinese thinking, even despite decades of modern Maoist brainwashing techniques. Lao Tzu refused Confucius an initiation into Tao. Perhaps the underlying thing here is the outer teachings that Confucius sought to bring to the authorities could never become the inner emptiness beloved of Taoists. That is why I mentioned the quote in the beginning of this episode. This is quite significant because it meant that however famous Confucius became as a result of his collecting of wisdom for the use of the emperor's court, he would remain uninitiated and therefore exoteric. Lao Tzu, on the other hand, was a master who sought out the immortals and belongs to a very different order of knowledge. For centuries, the Chinese court of the emperor took advice from a man called the Mag, M-A-G. He was a magical advisor who wore a type of conical wizard's hat, which was gold in colour. The symbol of the Mag was a four-armed cross, which had splayed ends, not dissimilar to that of the Knights Templar. The Mag, it was said, had profound knowledge of the stars, and it is attested by the fact that they knew of the 19-year-old metonic cycle. That's when the moon's phases recur on the same days of the solar year. It's also used in the West by the midst of ancient societies, including the Druids themselves. Some researchers, such as Robert Temple, writing in his book The Crystal Sun, go further still. He advanced the theory that the ancient Chinese had come by great scientific knowledge. Temple believed that he'd found ancient evidence inside Chinese texts with the foundation work on the Taoist way. He believed that they'd created telescopes and knew about lens grinding way before modern times, and this hasn't been accepted, of course. And he wrote another book, The Genius of China, in which he realized that practically everything had been invented in China in ancient times. My dear friend, the late Colin Wilson, in correspondence with author John Michel, considered that the ancients knew that numbers represented all types of forces and motion, and he talked to me about that. Numbers therefore became symbolic. It is no accident that we should learn that the ancient Chinese Taoists constructed a divination system called the I Ching, also known as the Book of Changes. This divinatory system consists of 64 hexagrams. We've mentioned 2 connected to Wang Mu, each one being based on a combination of 2 trigrams. The trigrams are made of broken lines and solid lines, which represent the female energy and the male energy. The trigrams are made of broken lines and solid lines, which represent both the female and male energies. Yes and no, sun and moon, male and female. No one can say for sure where the oracle came from, but it's generally ascribed to the mythical Serpent King, the first emperor of China, Fu Si. In fairness, its invention is shrouded in mystery, rather like the tarot, and there are some who say it may not even be Chinese in origin, and I'm one of those, but drawn from a far older source. That may be a discussion for another podcast. Mr. Wilson was one of those who began to consider the relationship between the number of hexagrams, 64, and the relationship to DNA. DNA in the cells of human bodies has 4 chemical bases. Others may hark back to previous episodes and the step diagram of Gurdjieff, which also talks about the 8-note octave. 8 times 8 equals 64. Wilson wrote in his book, it's a marvellous book, if you haven't read it, please do, Atlantis to the Sphinx. Colin talks about a man named Hayes, who had made this connection between DNA and the I Ching. This is Wilson's words. Hayes recalled that when he had studied the I Ching in his hippie days, he had wondered vaguely why the number of its hexagrams, each one made up of 2 trigrams, should be 64. 8 times 8, and not 7 times 7 or 9 times 9. And he learned that each of the triplet units of RNA, links up with another triplet in the DNA molecule, so the double helix of information in the heart of all reproductive cells is made up from 64 hexagrams, as in I Ching. Could this really be just a coincidence? Well, that's the words of Colin Wilson. Interestingly, early images uncovered in the 1920s by archaeologist Stein depict the legendary Fu Zi and his sister Nu Hua, the siblings both inhabitants of the legendary Kunlun Mountains, are entwined by shared serpent legs in a double helix that strongly resembles DNA. Another singular aspect of this early painting is that they hold aloft above their heads what appears to be tools of masonry, the compass and the square. These implements rule the heavens and earth respectively. In some legends the brother and sister marry, but are ashamed and cover up their faces in shame with a fan, which is a wedding symbol in China to this day. Nu Hua is a flood deity credited with saving mankind and repairing the sacred pillar that ascends to heaven. Like the goddess Wang Mu, there is yet another connection to the Plough constellation in America, Big Dipper. The painting featuring the pair has the constellation in the uppermost part of the frieze. Nu Hua is a flood goddess whose name is familiar, and it sounds a lot like Noah. Nu Hua, Noah, Nu Hua. Perhaps it's a coincidence, but then these familiar themes will continue to go on as we cross the Himalayas and the secrets of that Silk Road. Nu Hua. In Chinese mythology, 8 persons survived the flood, including Nu Hua, who in turn repopulated the earth after the Great Cataclysm. It appears from Taoist sources, inventors of the I Ching, Tai Chi, acupuncture, Feng Shui, and the rest of the ancient sciences, that this knowledge came to us via immortals who survived a great flood. In episode 2 of The Secret Himalayas, we mentioned Idris Shah, and we treated his claims cautiously, but now we introduce a maverick anthropologist, inventor, and historian called James Churchward. It is here at this juncture that we must again exercise some prudence in assessing the information. There is no doubt that Churchward, who spent most of his life pursuing evidence of a pre-flood civilization, made a great contribution to the swathe of books on this subject that have followed. He is the source of many good inquiries. His researches into ancient symbolism and remarkable similarities between cultures, shared words, almost identical myths of the Great Flood, and so on. His legacy as a nonconformist historian has led academia to dismiss his conclusions and point out inaccuracies in his disclosures. For pedantic historians, he is criticized for finding a map. He said it was in Tibet, but then later India or something like that. But we must remember that these borders are shifting sands, as we observed in Sikkim when we talked about that. It's now part of India, once claimed by Tibet, and China also had a hand in these affairs. With these sheer breadth of material around the world, much visited by him in person, from Polynesia, North and Central America, India, Egypt, Europe, some might forgive a small mistake in where a map was originally first viewed and seen. Detractors say the story of James Churchward is a case of a man desperate for recognition, and that he's fabricated events to support his theories. Critics challenge his claims as mere pseudoscience, ramblings of a madman, and totally discredited him based on hoaxes. As for his own account of being privy to sacred texts in an unknown tongue, this has been swept aside. His tale, like others in this series, The Secret Himalayas, is remarkable and therefore worthy of another look, at least to the open-minded. Colonel James Churchward, born 1851, died in 1936, was born in Devon, England, into a large family household. He had a bright, inquiring mind and used his talents as an inventor and made several important contributions to the war effort of World War I, creating a type of steel armour for the US Navy. He is credited with inventing the alloy vanadium. Like some Englishmen of his day, he found himself in the colonies, and in this case Ceylon, which is now called Sri Lanka, working as a tea planter. His elder brother was well-known Masonic author Albert Churchward. It's clear that James had a deep interest in the esoteric. He'd already met with distinguished photographer and antiquarian Le Plongeon, who made studies into the pre-Columbian ruins of South America. The pair are said to have discussed Atlantis and Mu. The central theme of his books is always Mu. He's written a number: The Lost Continent of Mu, The Sacred Symbols of Mu, The Cosmic Forces of Mu, The Children of Mu, as well as some other historical books supporting similar theories surrounding the origins of our civilization. In these works, Churchward advanced that a lost continent lay beneath the Pacific, sunk many thousands of years before in a cataclysm of an event of a great deluge. During this flood, he claimed half of the Earth's population died. They were remembered in many myths and legends recounted around the entire globe. Churchward used his fortune, which was considerable, plus his erudite knowledge of geology, metallurgy, chemistry, history and archaeology to investigate his theories, and he travelled widely in this quest to prove Mu. But this story began not in the West but the East during 1868, while serving in the Indian Raj as a British soldier helping with famine relief. That he met a high priest and they talked about some stone tablets. The priest told him that these stone tablets were about a previous civilization which he called Mu. Churchward's ears pricked up. He realized that Mu was Atlantis, the same sort of mythos, and he wanted to see those stone tablets. 6 months passed and Churchward had accepted defeat, as the priest had no intention of breaking his vows to protect the relics. Then one evening, whilst paying a visit to the priest, he saw the clay tablets laid out in front of him for his perusal. Churchward soon became an avid student of Nakal, learning how to decipher the tablets for himself. This Nakal is the language that they are written in. He confirms in his book, The Lost Continent of Mu, that these clay tablets written in Nakal were the genuine records of Mu. His task soon became a lifelong passion and led him to conclude that all ancient culture as we know it came from our antediluvian forebears and enjoyed a common myth and symbology of the Great Flood across the globe. Some of his depositions compelling, and he cites a document called the Lhasa Record found by archaeologist Paul Schliemann, grandson of the celebrated Heinrich Schliemann, who discovered Troy. Paul Schliemann found his fame in one of the oldest monasteries in Lhasa, because the document he found was not an original but a translation, and Churchward noted some minor mistakes within it, but was otherwise happy to part publish it as further testimony to Mu. The extract from the Lhasa Record, as he published it, the unfortunate aspect was that the Lhasa Record of Paul Schliemann was a complete hoax, leaving Churchward undermined. Needless to say, none of this impressed his colleagues in academia, for there is evidence that I will present to suggest that we should not draw our conclusions too hastily on old Churchward. The legendary Mu, or Lemuria, was situated in the Pacific Ocean. He said the existence of the continent could be determined by reading the universal hieroglyphs found around the Pacific Rim and beyond. Behind the folktales and legends lay an untold story of the destruction of Atlantis and its vanished highly advanced seafaring civilization. Churchward contended that the survivors of Mu in their disaster established sacred centers of initiates who passed knowledge down to other less developed humans. For example, he believed the Nakals, the writers of the clay tablets that he had been shown by the priest, passed their knowledge on to the Brahmin caste, who to this day jealously guard their secrets. The legendary Nakal, who hailed from Mu, were, Churchward told us, maintain the source of all esoteric teachings and magic, including the Eastern mantra Om. The Nakal are also equated with the Naga, these serpent people who are mentioned in the Indian classics such as the Mahabharata, and are regarded as sacred deities across Asia. But Churchward did not stop there. He spoke of the high initiates of Mu surviving the global catastrophe, who became gods of our legends. He believed that they passed on their secrets, including spiritual teachings, which became all religions. But academia tells us that Churchward and Mu is nothing more than a myth. Why I'm going to challenge this is, on these episodes of the Secret Himalayas, I'd like to dredge up one or two interesting connections. And I'm going to bring up something now which is called the cord of Mu. This has got nothing to do with Churchward. It is a traditional Tibetan, or even pre-Buddhist Tibetan practice. And I'm going to take you back now into the mist of time, but I'm also going to come back to Churchward and why some of his theories might hold clues to our own origin and innate racial memories in our own blood and DNA. From the outside, it is hard to tell Tibetan Buddhism and another religion called Bön. To the untrained eye, both seem very similar. Tibetan artwork and deities take on a similar aspect, but the main difference between them is a rival approach to the history of Tibet. Behind the Bön are several layers of belief, even different forms of the religion, and some of this is allied to the original shamanistic practices of Central Asia. The shamans would recognize some of the activities and techniques, but there are also local deities which are often incorporated inside Bön, such as the practice of worshipping mountain spirits and nagas that we've mentioned, the naga serpent goddesses and gods. But I don't want to get bogged down in this and just say that Bön equates to really an amalgam of techniques, but you should say that Tibetan Buddhism is really a watered down version of Bön, but that is very controversial. According to Tibetan legends, its Bön kings had the power to appear in any realm in an instant using the cord of Mu. In Tibetan this is the Dumurdag, or in older Bön language, in the old kingdom of Zanzung, the Mu Zag. Whether the myth suggests movement rather like teleportation or by means of actual aviation is an unsettled point. This cord was said to represent earth and heaven, and when the kings descended to heaven they did so by using the cord of Mu. There is a version of this called the Mu ladder, which again ascends to connect heaven and has allowed mankind's first ancestor to descend to earth, featured in the legend of the ancient king called the Grigum. It all begins to sound like Churchward, doesn't it? Flying transports, the origin of the race, the name called Mu. Tibetan history states that the very first 7 kings of its history were direct descendants of beings in heaven, being connected to their homeland by this cord, a cord that ran from the top of their heads to the sky. The thread has a very complex nature, which is described by the Bön practitioners, and I'll just explain some of this. When the kings passed away, there was no corpse, and they simply ascended to heaven via this cord. The first 7 kings of Tibet were immortal. Now, how did it come to pass that they became mere mortals? One king took a bet with a groom. Why he found himself a mere mortal, unlike his royal forebears, is that he chose to sever the cord of Mu, and thereby lost his connection to heaven. He was stuck here, basically. In the legend of King Grigum, the ruler had his mind seized by a demon, or a more Western approach, maybe he goes insane. He prophesies he will die by the sword, and at one point he arranges a duel with a horse groom. Essentially, he is tricked into a situation where he cuts his own cord above his head and therefore becomes mortal. The horse groom kills him, marries his wife, but the Naga spirits in the river called the Klu have a different idea, and they take revenge on his behalf. And that is a very old Tibetan tale, but that's to do with the cord of Mu. Other research on the cord of Mu says that it has an inner meaning, which means self-nourished, and is important in the lexical understanding of Tibetan myths, and it suggests also a magical child. Returning to the Mu cord once again, the term is used mundanely inside houses and tents to refer to the hole that lets smoke outside from the central fire out of the tent and so on, as an exit point. It's also used to name the line that holds the ubiquitous prayer flags of Tibet. So when you see those prayer flags, the string holding them is the cord of Mu. Tibet also has priests of Mu, and there is one clan which is actually called Mu. And if you look at the Tibetan flag, you will notice sun rays, and one of these sun rays, of course, represents the Mu ancestral clan, are associated with a much older kingdom, way before Tibet, called Zanzung. The Mu tribe, by tradition, like their spiritual leader of the Bon, came from a Shambhala-like paradise. Other sub-elements of the Mu tribe also reached high spiritual status, such as the Guribs. They produced several historic saints and holy figures, and had the sense to preserve the manuscripts of the teachings of their monk Oza, which have recently resurfaced. Inside the lines left by monk Oza, there is a curious text with reference to the origins of the Mu clan. We are the clan of Gurib, are not like others. We are emanated from the god of effulgence. Thus we are radically distinguished from others. Now these mysterious words are the folk tales taken from the Gurib, direct descendants of the Mu Yangje, who descended from heaven to marry a mortal. The Mu tribe were also on hand to assess the rights of other tribes who requested access to their deities. At this early period, the use of direct communion with spirits using mirrors would have been a likely service provided. It is clear that the tribe of Mu held a special status in these royal bloodlines of the clans. According to the Bon lineages, Tompa Shenrab, which is the main god of that pantheon, descended 5 generations from some of the royal Mu lineage. This is the importance and their connection with the Bon version of Shambhala. It would have been easy to talk about the Bon version of Shambhala in all of this section, to explain Shambhala, as the two concepts are almost interchangeable. Let's just keep this simple. We want to get to the bottom of this. The Bon are inextricably linked with the sacred symbol of the swastika, which is also the main symbol employed in the Bon religion. And now we've got an actual place that we can identify, which is one of the holy sites of Asia, which is also connected to the Mu tribe and Bon, and it's called Mount Kailash. The spirit worshipped there is known as Mei Rei, and 4 rivers emanate from Mount Kailash, hence why it's associated with the swastika, with the 4 arms. And if you remember, the advisor to the Chinese emperors was the Mag, mentioned earlier, who wore the conical hat, golden in colour, whose sacred symbol was the 4-armed cross. Bon texts tell us specifically that All Mu Long Ring, which is their version of Shambhala, the sacred mountain, was found at the middle of the ancient kingdom of the now defunct Zanzung. If you remember, at the beginning of this episode, talked about the peach goddess, whose connection was with the Big Dipper, or the plough as we call it in the UK. Now this is also an association with Mount Kailash of the Bon. Yet again do we take a step closer to the places frequented by the masters. The antiquity of the Bun and Zanzung is not conservative, and the Mu people trace back their lineage just to the ascendancy of Tompa Shenrig to 16,027 BC, which is completely impossible according to historians. With such a tradition behind them, as ancient as it was, it's irresistible to think that Lao Tzu may have left his home in search of further wisdom, and if it's true that he went to the Kunlun mountains, which also straddle Tibet, it is very compelling to think that he may have been under the training of such people, and therefore the tale ends there. Thank you for joining us once again. Hope you enjoyed the show. Do join us again for further episodes of the Secret Himalayas. Goodbye for now.